On September 18, 2017, Nobel laureate Eric Maskin became the latest recipient of the HEC Paris Honoris Causa award. This is traditionally given to exceptional heads of state, professors, and business leaders. After accepting the award, the pioneer in mechanism design and implementation theory proceeded to describe to a packed audience his application of mechanism design on current electoral systems. Earlier in the day, Professor Maskin elaborated on his proposals to radically change the way we elect presidents in the West. But he also shared with us his vision of global warming, his opinions on the universal basic income, his forewarning of the 2008-2009 financial crisis, and his commitment to social justice. There was also his call for economists to relativize radical economic changes through historical perspective. But I first asked Professor Maskin if the mechanism design theory that bagged him the Nobel Prize for Economy in 2007 had evolved with the times.
Well, I've continued to be very interested in the field of mechanism design. In the 10 years since 2007, I would say I have concentrated on several particular applications of the theory. One of those applications I'll be talking about this evening, and that's to the design of election systems.
We'll come back to that.
And we'll come back to that. Another application has been to the field of, well, it's also, I think, quite timely, but to dealing with global warming. It's quite apparent that in order to solve that problem, countries of the world need to come together to create a mechanism for limiting greenhouse gas emissions. The Paris Accords of 2016 are an example of such a mechanism. That probably was not enough to solve the problem, but any such mechanism needs to take into account not just the goals of the group, but also the incentives of the individual participants, the individual countries, and trying to balance those two perspectives is where mechanism design comes in. So I've been interested in the issue of how do you create agreements, how do you create mechanisms which the participants actually have an incentive to join.
You once said mechanism design is an irresistible mix of precision, rigor, and sometimes the beauty of pure math, combined with proposals to solve problems of real social importance. Is this definition still valid for you?
Well, it was relevant then, and it remains relevant. In a sense, anytime pure market forces do not deliver the sort of outcomes that we want to have, something has to be brought in to augment the market, and that's where mechanism design becomes relevant. If the market works fine on its own, then you have no mechanism design issue. You just let markets work in their invisible hand fashion. But markets are not successful in all settings, and we had a very dramatic example of that in the financial crisis of 2008, 2009, where financial markets in particular blew up. And I think that event made it clear to people for whom it wasn't already clear that financial markets cannot be left simply to work on their own, that there's an instability problem that arises with financial markets that has to be solved through a regulatory process, and designing regulatory processes is where you need mechanism design. So if you like, the financial crisis was a great example of how mechanism design is even more relevant than many people thought.
So you proposed a very prescient analysis of what was to become the financial crash of 2008. Would you say the same for your study of political systems, in which, again, you use the mechanism design theory?
Indeed. Many people are wondering, how could it have happened that a figure such as Donald Trump could become president? Of course, the answer, how did he become president, is a complicated one, but part of the answer has to do with the particular election system that is used in the US. In my view, and I'm going to go into some detail this evening, the American election system has very deep flaws. And those flaws worked to Donald Trump's advantage. For example, he became the Republican nominee for president only because the other major candidates all canceled each other out. There were 16 other candidates, and in effect, they split the votes, the anti-Trump votes, among themselves, and it was because they split the votes that Trump was able to win the early primary elections, which was where he became well known and where his popularity started growing. This to have a split vote is not a necessary part of an election system. That is, it is possible to design better systems where if you have two or more candidates who are similar in the way that the mainstream Republican candidates were similar, they don't end up canceling each other out, and they don't end up leading to the election of somebody who is completely different. You can design more sensible systems in which you get a more sensible outcome, and that.
Indeed, I mean, you are proposing what you call a far superior system. Could you
Yes.
perhaps outline it?
Yes, well, interestingly, this was a system that originated not from my work, but from work done in the 18th century by Condorcet, the Marquis de Condorcet, who was a distinguished mathematician and philosopher. He was a member of the French Academy of Sciences, and what he proposed and what my work shows was actually a very good idea, was that voters have the option of doing more than just saying who their favorite candidate is. That's the way most election systems work these days, but under Condorcet, a voter could say, well, I like candidate A the best, but if A doesn't win, then I want B. And if B doesn't win, then I want C. In other words, voters should have the option of ranking candidates, of expressing their preferences over candidates more fully than just naming their favorite candidate. And what Condorcet said we should do with these rankings is that we should look for a candidate who would be the winner, who, according to the rankings, would beat each of the other candidates by a majority. So if there were 3 candidates running A, B, and C, candidate A would be the winner if a majority of voters rank A above B, and also a majority of voters rank A above C. In that case, A would be truly the majority favorite of the population because A would beat both of these candidates by a majority.
There is another proposal for change in the electoral process. This time it's called majority judgment, and it was suggested by Michel Balaski and Rida Lavaki. When it was published, you called this method, I quote you, controversial but deserving of careful consideration. How do you compare their approach to your own?
Well, what Belinsky and Larrikey do is to have voters do even more than what Condorcet suggests. Under Condorcet, voters are ranking candidates. Under Belinsky, Larrikey, voters are actually grading candidates. So if there's a 5-point scale, you would grade a candidate 5 if this candidate were absolutely outstanding, at the top of the list, and 1 if the candidate were terrible, and somewhere in between for a candidate who was at neither extreme. And then you would elect the candidates who got the highest average score or highest median score. So that's an interesting idea, and I endorsed their book on the subject by agreeing that it's an interesting idea. I think there are 2 serious problems with it. The first is that we don't have an obvious standard by which to say a candidate is wonderful or a candidate is terrible. If we're evaluating Olympic skaters, then there are some very well-defined criteria by which we say this candidate is truly, this contestant is truly outstanding, or this candidate is truly terrible. In politics, we don't have objective standards at all, and so it's not obvious what these grades mean when it comes to politics, where the standards are so ambiguous. But even if they were clear cut, even if we knew what it meant for a candidate to be excellent or a candidate to be terrible, there are incentives for distorting your grading as a voter. For example, suppose that there are 2 candidates for president. There's Emmanuel Macron and there's François Fillon. And suppose that you happen to think, as a voter, that Macron is a little bit better than Fillon, but not much better. Well, then, according to Belinsky and laureate, you might give Macron a 4 and Fillon a 3. But if you were an actual voter, you would be tempted, if you thought Macron was better, to exaggerate the difference between the two. You wouldn't say Macron's a 4, Fillon's a 3. You would say Macron's a 5 and Fillon's a 1, because after all, you want Macron to win. So why not give Macron as much advantage as possible? So for that reason too, I think asking voters to grade candidates is not going to work very well. The one advantage of the true majority rule, the Condorcet system, is that voters have no incentive to distort their rankings. They will give for strategic purposes. They have every incentive to report their rankings truthfully.
Professor Maskin, beyond these honorific titles, you say you care deeply about social justice. That includes allocating a fair share of wealth to the members of society. Could you elaborate on your vision of spreading economic wealth around the world?
Yes, well, some of my research has been on the topic of income inequality, and I've been especially interested in the phenomenon of inequality in developing countries. Much of the current political discussion has been focused on rich countries like the US and France and Britain, where inequality has certainly been increasing, and that's cause for concern. But it should be noted that developing countries have this problem too. So China has become more unequal. India has become more unequal. And in a sense, the question of why they have become more unequal is even deeper than for the rich countries, because there's an old idea in economics, the theory of comparative advantage, which says that developing countries should move in the opposite direction when they are exposed to global markets. Globalization should give unskilled workers more benefits from opening up the system to global markets than skilled workers receive. So we should see unskilled wages rising relative to skilled wages as a result of globalization. Well, that's what the theory says, but that's actually not what has happened in practice. And so in my work on this subject, which is in collaboration with Michael Kremer, who is a development economist at Harvard, we've proposed an alternative theory or a supplementary theory which tries to explain why inequality has been increasing in China and in India and in many other developing countries, and what can be done about that inequality. And what we argue is that it's been the internationalization of the production process itself that has worked against unskilled workers. So now many goods, think of computers, for example, are actually produced internationally. They might be designed in the US and the software might be written in Europe, but the assembly then happens in China. This is true of thousands of other goods too, but the process tends to favor workers with skills. So the computer companies want to hire workers who already have some training. And that's very good for the workers who have training. They see their wages go up. But if you don't have any background, you're left behind. And that, we argue, is where the inequality has come from. The question is then, what do you do about that? And we would argue that part of the answer has to be government programs to reduce inequality. It cannot be left to market forces alone, because if you're a computer company and I'm an unskilled worker, you may not have sufficient incentive to train me, because if you do train me, yes, now I can work for you, but I can also work for your rival. And if I do work for your rival, then your investment in me, the training that you've put into me, has been lost. So that means that you're not going to, you may not train me. You may decline to train me in the first place. But if government creates a subsidy program in which private companies get some tax benefit, for example, for training unskilled workers, that can help solve the problem. If government gives poor families a cash transfer for sending their children to school, that can help solve the problem. There are many other things like that government can do to help narrow the skill gap, which in turn will help narrow the income gap. And so we argue that governments have to, in these developing countries, have to get involved in investing in unskilled workers if they are going to solve the inequality problem in those countries. In the case of governments, you vote for the government that has helped you or is likely to help you in the future. Governments have a direct incentive to look out for all of their voters. Companies don't have the same constituency. Companies have a narrower constituency, and so are not going to look out for workers that they're not hiring.
Another proposed solution for income inequality is the universal basic income. Its advocates include other Nobel Prize winners, and they are Peter Diamond and Christopher Pissarides. It also has caught the public imagination thanks to the bestseller of Rutger Bregman called Realistic Utopia. Your thoughts on this proposal?
Milton Friedman suggested a negative income tax. It is an old idea. And I think it's a useful idea because well, again, going back to the financial crisis and the recession that followed it, we had millions of people losing their jobs, millions of people facing the very serious question, how are they going to feed their families, keep their families housed? With a universal basic income, those immediate problems would have had solutions. So I think that a universal basic income, particularly for short run emergencies, is a great idea. It may create some tensions for the longer term. That is, if I'm guaranteed an income, whether I work or not, perhaps I won't make so much effort to actually find a job. But that's a tension that I think a society should be prepared to live with for the sake of ensuring that people are not failing to get the necessities of life. And looking ahead to a world where perhaps more and more labor is going to be performed by non-humans, by machines and robots, a basic income may become actually more important as more of us are replaced by machines.
You say you regret not having taken courses in macroeconomy and economic history as a student. Why?
Well, I've picked up some macro and some history on my own, but not in a very systematic way. Let me focus on the history. As economists, we often tend to focus on current problems. I mean, that's natural. But we don't always recognize sufficiently that the problems that we're facing today may not be unique in history. So for example, one major issue these days is what I was just talking about, the fact that many jobs are disappearing, being taken over by machines. This is not the first time in history when this has happened. In fact, the great industrial revolution of the 18th and early 19th century saw exactly those worries. And that particular revolution turned out to be pretty good for labor. In fact, it's true that many jobs were destroyed in the process, but many new jobs were created. It took a while. It took about 30 years for the new jobs to come along, but they did come along, And in the end, workers as a group were actually much better off. We saw the biggest increase in workers' wages in the 19th century that we had ever seen in history. And this was mostly due to new technology. Now, we don't know, of course, what is going to happen this time around. Every time is different, but certainly understanding what happened at the time of the original Industrial Revolution, I think, is valuable and relevant to a complete understanding of current trends. And so I think studying economic history is a valuable and important thing to do.
Finally, Professor Maskin, you were recently invited to the HEC Nobel Prize Awards at Harvard. Now, this is a tongue-in-cheek ceremony which rewards people who have done something for society and made them laugh at the same time. Is this a winning combination for you?
Well, I think the best reason for doing research is to be completely engaged, to be completely caught up in the question that you're trying to answer. And if the question has its lighter side, if it's something that makes you laugh, why not? That's an attraction too. I might not have personally worked on some of the topics that the Ig Nobel winners won their prizes for, but if they were fascinated by them, and that's good enough for me.
Well, my thanks to you, Professor Eric Maskin, Nobel Laureate in Economy 2007, and now HEC Paris Honoris Causa.